ever stared into the eyes of someone who seemed perfectly normal, only to discover they were hiding unimaginable darkness? Ted Bundy was the man next door. Handsome, intelligent, charming. But behind that mask was one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Over just 4 years, Bundy preyed on dozens of women, leaving behind fear, grief, and questions that still haunt us today. Ted Bundy was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His childhood was a secret wrapped in lies. Raised by his grandparents, he was told his mother was his sister. But when he discovered the truth as a teenager, it left him angry and deeply insecure. Even as a boy, there were disturbing signs showing. He once placed knives around his sleeping aunt. He built booby traps in the woods and even tortured small animals. Outwardly, he seemed shy and awkward, but beneath that surface, a storm was brewing. Bundy grew into a charming, charismatic young man. He studied psychology, volunteered in political campaigns, and even worked at a suicide hotline. People who knew him would describe him as polite and charming. But psychologists later agreed that Bundy was a textbook psychopath. He had no empathy, no conscience, no guilt. He saw people, especially women, as objects. Power and control thrilled him, and by the 1970s, those fantasies began spilling into reality. Linda and Healy was the kind of person who stood out without trying to. A University of Washington student in her early 20s, bright, outgoing, and deeply involved in campus life. She studied psychology, worked part-time as a radio ski reporter, and filled her days with a steady rhythm of classes, friends, and late-night studying. Her life had structure, a neat room, a regular schedule, and predictable routines. That's why, on the morning of February 1st, 1974, when she didn't show up for work, colleagues went to check up on her and found her bed neatly made. There was nothing out of place, as usual, except for the blood seeping through the pillow. Friends knew something was wrong. There were no signs of a struggle upstairs. But in the basement bedroom, investigators found blood on the pillowcase, and the nightgown she had worn to bed was missing. Her bicycle was untouched. Linda Healy had vanished overnight. Months later, when Bundy confessed, he admitted to abducting her from that room, striking her unconscious, and taking her body to a remote site in the mountains east of Seattle. Partial remains found there matched hers. She is considered Ted Bundy's first confirmed victim, the point where his secret violence finally intersected with public life. Donna Gail Manson was 19, a student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia. Quiet, artistic, a little reserved, she was the kind of person friends described as introspective, with a small circle and a gentle manner. On the evening of March 12, 1974, she left her dorm to attend a jazz concert on campus. She never arrived. No one ever saw her again. Posters went up across Olympia. Her friends joined the search, but there were no clues, sightings, or traces. Years later, Bundy would confess to killing her, claiming he burned parts of her remains to destroy evidence. Despite decades of forensic efforts, Donna Manson's body has never been recovered. Her disappearance deepened the fear spreading through Washington's campuses that spring, a quiet warning that the pattern had begun. Susan Elaine Rancourt was 18 years of age, a first-year biology student at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Bright, responsible, and well-liked, she balanced her studies with residence hall duties, the kind of young woman everyone expected to succeed. On the evening of April 17, 1974, Susan finished her laundry and headed across campus for a meeting of residence advisors. She never arrived. Classmates later recalled seeing a woman in a yellow jacket leaving her dorm that night. And then, nothing. When her clean clothes were found still in the washer, her friends knew something was wrong. For nearly a year, there were no answers. Then, in March 1975, partial remains were discovered on Taylor Mountain near Seattle. They matched Susan. The injuries showed signs of a violent assault, and investigators realized her case was part of a growing pattern across Washington's campuses. Just 3 weeks later, on May 6, 1974, 20-year-old Kathy Parks vanished from Oregon State University in Corvallis. She was quiet, studious, and deeply committed to her microbiology major. She was the kind of student who planned her days carefully, rarely missing a class or called home. That night, she left her dorm to meet friends but never arrived. Laundry, notes, everything she left behind told the same story. She intended to come back. Months later, her remains too were found on Taylor Mountain, confirming the fears of those who had begun to see a connection between the missing women. Bundy would later admit to abducting and killing both Susan and Kathy, two promising young women, taken from the safety of their campuses, their futures cut short. Their names now among the first fully confirmed in a series that had only just begun. Brenda Carroll Ball was 22, independent, kind-hearted, and known for her easy laugh. She had recently left college and was living around Seattle, working and spending time with friends, finding her way like so many young people in the mid-70s. On the night of May 31st, 1974, she went out to the Flame Tavern in Burien, a familiar spot for live music and conversation. Friends saw her there, relaxed and social, before she drifted outside into the parking lot just after closing time. Witnesses later recalled seeing her talking with a man, calm, confident, his arm in a sling. When Brenda didn't come home, her friends reported her missing. Weeks passed. There were no clear leads, no sign of where she'd gone. For her family, the silence became unbearable. Months later, in early March 1975, searchers on Taylor Mountain discovered human remains, later identified by dental records as Brenda's. The fractures on her skull spoke of violence. Her death was eventually tied to the same pattern that haunted the Pacific Northwest, a series of disappearances that seemed connected by something unseen but deliberate. Ted Bundy would later confess to abducting her that night. For investigators, Brenda's case helped trace the growing map of his crimes. For those who loved her, she remained a reminder of how suddenly an ordinary evening could turn into something unthinkable. Karen Eileen Campbell was 23, a young woman visiting Snowmass Village in Colorado, a place of ski lodges, tourists, and transient visitors. She worked seasonally and enjoyed the outdoors. Friends remembered her as lively and independent. On the night she disappeared, Karen was seen in a hotel corridor. The attack occurred inside what many assumed was a safe, domestic space, a hallway between rooms, and showed a stark escalation from daylight ruses to direct, forceful violence. Weeks later, her body was found, and the autopsy indicated blunt force injuries consistent with a violent assault. Investigators tied the killing into a wider interstate pattern of abductions. Bundy later admitted involvement in Colorado cases, and Karen's death became a grim marker of his widening geographic reach. Janice Annott was 23, a social worker from Issaquah known for her compassion and having a steady civic commitment. She spent the afternoon at Lake Sammamish with friends, a popular community gathering spot, ordinary, public, and bustling. Witnesses later described a polite man with his arm in a sling who asked for help with a sailboat, a small, believable deception designed to exploit Janice's tendency to help. She left the crowd to assist and never returned. The daylight abduction exposed how he could weaponize benign requests. Partial remains recovered at the Issaquah burial site were later associated with Janice. Her disappearance and discovery reinforced the investigators' conclusion that several local vanishings were connected, a realization that tied strikingly ordinary moments to extraordinary violence. Denise Naslund, 19, was a practical and engaged student, busy with coursework and friends, and planning a future like so many of her generation. A particular day at Lake Sammamish, she briefly left a picnic to look for a lost dog, just an everyday, compassionate act. Bundy used that small kindness as an opportunity. A ruse or distraction created a moment of isolation, and Denise was taken. The daylight setting, amid families and friends, made the crime feel impossible to foresee. Denise's remains were later found near the Issaquah site alongside other victims' remains. Forensic links and Bundy's later confessions tied her death into the same pattern that began to emerge across campus towns and recreational spaces. Her story is a reminder of how ordinary helpfulness became the opening he exploited. Nancy Wilcox was a neighbor and member of a close-knit Utah community. Unlike some other victims, fewer public details exist about her daily routines. Her disappearance took place in a suburban neighborhood and left a family searching for answers in a place they had thought safe. Investigative records and Bundy's later statements placed Nancy's murder in the Utah area. The accounts available indicate a sudden removal from ordinary neighborhood life. No public spectacle, no immediate clues, only an absence that rippled through her community. No remains were publicly recovered that permitted a traditional forensic identification. Law enforcement nevertheless classifies Nancy among the confirmed victims on the basis of Bundy's confessions and the broader investigative context. That classification brought painful clarity to a family that had waited too long for answers, but it offered no true closure. Melissa Ann Smith was an ordinary young woman with ordinary plans, the sort of person whose life reads, in hindsight, as painfully mundane. Friends and family remember her as part of a close-knit community. School, work, steady social routines, small ambitions that filled her days. She moved in normal circles, trusted by neighbors and classmates, not remarkable for fame, but for being reliably present in other people's lives. According to assembled investigative records, Melissa fit the same pattern seen in other cases. A deceptive approach, an apparent reason to trust, a brief moment that became the opening he needed. She was separated from the people and places that should have kept her safe, rendered helpless, and taken to a remote site. The sequence was deceptively simple and devastatingly effective. Law enforcement later tied Melissa's death to the same disposal sites and circumstantial evidence that linked several victims, and Bundy's later statements placed her among those he admitted to. That confirmation brought a painful clarity, an answer to who had done it, but not to how the family would live with the absence. Melissa's story is a reminder that the danger Bundy exploited lived inside ordinary moments, a trusted gesture, a small kindness, a routine encounter that ended in loss. Bundy's activity in Colorado during the mid-1970s illustrates how mobile and opportunistic he became. Working seasonal jobs and traveling through resort towns, he encountered women in transient settings, ski lodges, taverns, and rural roads, and used the same deceptive charm or sudden force to isolate them. The Colorado incidents demonstrated a widening geographic footprint and a willingness to attack beyond college campuses. Investigations in Colorado were complicated by the limits of forensic science at the time, the movement of bodies across rugged terrain, and fragmented jurisdictional communication. When remains were recovered and later matched by dental records or corroborating detail, those cases moved into the confirmed column. In other instances, Bundy's confessions offered specifics that investigators could not fully corroborate, leaving some disappearances as confessed but unconfirmed or strongly suspected. Colorado's role in the larger timeline is twofold. It expanded investigators' understanding of his movements and methods, and it revealed the urgent need for better cooperation between counties and states. Bundy's time in Florida in 1978 represents one of the most brutal and legally consequential chapters in his crimes. There, his offenses escalated beyond the regional pattern of daytime campus abductions into nighttime invasions of private residences, including sorority houses, and the abduction of a young child. These attacks were brazen in their location and severity, but they directly produced the evidence and prosecutions that would eventually lead to his death sentences. Across the Florida cases, the same mechanics reappear: a confident approach, a ruse or forced entry to create isolation, and a removal from communal space to a place where he could exert total control. Investigators pieced the crimes together through witness accounts, physical evidence at scenes, and forensic analysis. In some instances, bodies were recovered and forensically linked by distinctive injuries and disposal patterns. In others, ambiguity remained until Bundy's later confessions filled in the gaps. The cumulative weight of the Florida evidence proved decisive in the courtroom. Beyond conviction, the Florida period also forced hard changes in investigative practice. The brutality and brazenness of the crimes produced public outrage, faster interagency cooperation, and increased focus on forensic methods that could connect crimes across jurisdictions. But even with these advances, the Colorado and Florida chapters ended with unresolved questions about victims still suspected but not fully confirmed, and with families whose grief lasted long after the legal process reached its conclusion. Ted Bundy was first arrested in August 1975 in Utah. A highway patrolman had spotted a Volkswagen Beetle speeding. Inside, investigators found a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, and burglary tools, items that echoed earlier disappearances and raised immediate suspicion. Yet Bundy was far from finished. In June 1977, during hearings in Aspen, Colorado, he was allowed to enter the courthouse law library unrestrained. Within moments, hidden behind shelves, he slipped through a window and jumped. He injured an ankle on landing, then slipped into the wilderness. For 6 days, he wandered mountain trails, evading roadblocks, breaking into cabins for supplies, stealing clothes and food, navigating by dawnlight. Lawmen mounted one of the most intense manhunts Colorado had seen. He was recaptured, extradited, and placed in another Colorado jail. But he didn't stop. On December 30th, 1977, with much of the jail staff on holiday, he crawled through a ceiling panel he'd sawed and slipped into a crawl space. He emerged inside the jailer's quarters, changed into civilian clothes, and walked out the front door. Once free, Bundy stole a car and left Glenwood Springs. He changed transit methods: bus, plane, train. He sought anonymity while crossing state lines. He headed toward Florida, where he believed he could hide among crowds. In February 1978, the chase finally ended. Florida officers stopped a stolen Volkswagen Beetle near Pensacola. The man behind the wheel tried to flee, kicking the officer's legs. A struggle ensued. Bundy was subdued. Inside the car, multiple IDs belonging to female students, stolen credit cards, and more evidence pointing to serious crimes. He was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. The arrest would become the turning point. No more escapes. His final murders in Florida would seal his fate. Bundy's trials became a national spectacle. In Florida, he chose to represent himself, relishing the spotlight. His charm that once fooled women now played out in front of the cameras. But the evidence was undeniable. Eyewitnesses, bite mark analysis, fibers. In 1979, he was convicted for the Chi Omega murders. In 1980, he was sentenced again the murder for Kimberly Leach. Both carried the death penalty. Even facing execution, Bundy manipulated the system, delaying his fate with appeals. He offered confessions to dozens of murders, hoping to stall the inevitable. On January 24, 1989, before dawn, Florida State Prison came alive with an uneasy tension. Beyond its concrete walls, crowds gathered, some silent in reflection, others chanting beneath the glow of television lights. Inside, the air was still. At 7:16 a.m., the sentence was carried out. For the first time in more than a decade, the man whose charm once masked his cruelty was finally still. By sunrise, the news was everywhere. Headlines, radio bulletins, flickering TV reports. Across the country, people reacted in different ways. Relief, anger, disbelief. Some called it justice. Others called it an ending that explained nothing. But the story didn't end with the man. It turned inward, into the minds of psychologists, criminologists, and writers who spent years asking why. His case reshaped forensic psychology, fueling new studies on psychopathy, manipulation, and criminal behavior. And for those left behind, the victims, families, the survivors, the memory became something quieter. Not the face of a killer, but the long echo of what he took. Today, his name remains a warning that evil can disguise itself in charm and hide in plain sight. While Bundy's name became a symbol of evil, it's the victims who must be remembered. Linda and Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Kimberly Leach. Each one, a daughter, a sister, a friend, ordinary people whose stories were cut short. Their names remind us that behind every headline was a life interrupted, a family changed forever. In their memory, communities have built gardens, held vigils, and promised vigilance so that the next warning sign isn't ignored. Because remembering them isn't just looking back, it's how we move forward.